Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. David never thought he would be the type to spy on his own wife. But then, he also never thought Anna, his wife of 5 years, would give him reason to. The suspicions started with whispered phone calls and late nights at the office, excuses that felt too smooth to be true. Yesterday, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had installed hidden CCTV cameras throughout their apartment on the 10th floor. Today, he came home early from work, his mind a battleground of doubt and guilt. The sight that greeted him was jarring, an unfamiliar pair of men's shoes by the door, definitely not his size. His heart sank further when he saw that Anna had locked herself in the bedroom. He called out to her, but the door remained shut, her voice muffled and distressed on the other side. "Anna, please, can we talk?" David's voice was steady, but his hands shook. There was no response, only the sound of shuffling and a faint sobbing that seeped through the door. Hours passed, marked by the slow ticking of the hallway clock, and still, the door remained closed. David searched the apartment, confusion and fear mounting. There was no sign of anyone else, and every exit was untouched. They lived on the 10th floor. Escape through a window wasn't just improbable, it was impossible. When Anna finally emerged, her eyes were red, her face pale. She avoided his gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "I need some air," she said, slipping past him and out of the apartment. Left alone, David's mind raced. The tension, the secrecy, it was all too much. He had to know what was going on. He turned on the monitor connected to the CCTV, half hoping, half dreading to uncover the truth of Anna's indiscretions. But nothing had prepared him for what he found. The footage was clear, Anna, looking distraught, dragging something heavy across the bedroom floor. It was then David noticed the suitcase by the bed, slightly ajar, an arm hanging limply out. His breath caught in his throat as he approached, every step heavy with dread. Inside, a man lay motionless, his skin pale and cold to the touch. Panic seized David as he checked for a pulse and found none. The room spun around him. He was no detective, but he knew immediately that this was the man from the shoes, the supposed lover who had hidden in their bedroom. The early morning found David awake, sitting in their living room surrounded by the blue flicker of police lights outside. Anna was sobbing uncontrollably in the corner, her body racked with guilt and shock. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she kept repeating, but her words were lost in the gravity of the scene. As the police arrived, David explained everything, showing them the CCTV footage that captured the tragic sequence of events. The footage revealed no cunning escape plan, no lover's spat turned violent. Instead, it showed a desperate Anna struggling alone to conceal the man in the suitcase. "I never knew," was all David could say as he watched the police take Anna away. She had made a grave mistake, a misjudgment that had spiraled into something horrific. And as the reality of his wife's arrest set in, David couldn't help but feel that their lives had irrevocably changed. Sitting alone in the now quiet apartment, the weight of his decisions pressed down on him. The cameras had been meant to unveil a betrayal, but instead, they had uncovered a tragedy. And as the sun rose over the city, David was left to ponder the justice that had been served and the price of the truth he had sought. The fluorescent lights of the police station cast a harsh glow over everything, washing out the faces of those who sat waiting. David rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the events that had led him here. He was seated across from Detective Marcus Lane, a man whose reputation for thoroughness was well known in the precinct. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Lane began, his voice even, "can you run through the events one more time? It's crucial we understand everything exactly as it happened." David recounted the story, his voice faltering as he described finding the lifeless body. Beside him, Anna's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Carter, took notes. "And you installed cameras because you suspected an affair?" Ms. Carter interjected, her tone skeptical. "Yes," David admitted, avoiding her piercing gaze. I thought maybe she was seeing someone." The detective nodded, scribbling down notes. And the cameras didn't show how this man entered your apartment? No, he was just there, David replied, feeling a surge of frustration. How had the man entered? Why hadn't the cameras caught him? The door to the interrogation room opened, and a uniformed officer escorted a middle-aged woman inside. This is Mrs. Helen Baxter, Detective Lane introduced. She lives in the apartment directly below yours. Mrs. Baxter sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I heard noises, she said without prompting, her voice quavering. Thumping, like something heavy was being moved. And, crying. Crying. Detective Lane looked up sharply. Yes, Mrs. Baxter nodded. It was late at night. I thought it strange because it sounded like a man's voice. David felt a chill. The plot was thickening, and none of it made sense. He glanced at Anna, whose face was pale, her eyes downcast. Detective Lane thanked Mrs. Baxter before turning his attention back to David and Anna. We'll need to search your apartment again, look for any possible hidden entry points or anything out of the ordinary. As the detective spoke, another officer entered the room, whispering something into Lane's ear. The detective's expression shifted subtly. We've just received the preliminary autopsy report, he announced, turning the paper so David could see. The cause of death was not blunt force trauma as we suspected. He was poisoned. Poisoned. David gasped. The room seemed to spin. Poison? How? And more importantly, why? Yes, and there's something else. Detective Lane paused, his gaze settling on Anna. The toxicology report found traces of a rare toxin, one that's not easy to come by. It's used primarily in research labs. David turned to Anna, his heart pounding. She was a research scientist, her lab worked with all manner of compounds. Could it be? Anna met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. David, I wouldn't. Her protest was cut short by Detective Lane. Mrs. Thompson, we're going to need to talk about your work, about the lab where you are employed. The interrogation stretched on as the layers of the night's events began to unravel further. Every answer seemed to only birth more questions. David felt the solid ground of his understanding slip away beneath him. Was it possible Anna was involved more deeply than he could have imagined? Or was there another explanation, one that they were missing? As he left the station, the morning air felt unusually cold. The truth was elusive, hiding in shadows that seemed to deepen with every discovery. The sharp clang of the precinct door echoed behind David as he stepped into the brisk morning air. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and dread. Anna was being held for further questioning, and with each passing moment, the situation seemed to spiral deeper into chaos. David's phone vibrated, a message from Anna's brother, Michael, asking for an urgent meeting. He suggested a quiet cafe nearby, away from the prying eyes and ears of their mutual acquaintances. Seated across from Michael, David noticed the worry etched deeply into his features. Michael leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. David, this doesn't make sense. Anna wouldn't hurt anyone. There's got to be a mistake. I want to believe that, Michael, but the evidence, David began, but Michael interrupted. Evidence can be misleading. You said it yourself, the man was already in the apartment, and the cameras didn't catch him entering. How is that possible? David sighed, rubbing his forehead. I don't know, Michael. I don't know. Michael glanced around before speaking again. Listen, I've been doing some digging. The man in the suitcase, his name was Eric Dalton. He worked with Anna at the lab, but he was also involved in some risky business on the side. Risky business? David frowned. Yeah, underground stuff. Illegal experiments. And I heard he had debts, big ones, to some dangerous people. David absorbed this new information, his mind racing. If Eric was mixed up in something illegal, could his death have been related to his dealings, not an affair? I need to see the lab, David decided suddenly. Maybe there's something there, something the police missed. Michael nodded in agreement. I'll see what I can arrange. But be careful, David. We don't know who else might be involved in this. The lab was a sprawling facility, filled with the sterile scent of chemicals and the quiet hum of machinery. David was escorted by a security officer, his presence officially logged as a visitor. The officer remained with him, a silent overseer to his every move. David wandered through the lab, passing rows of high-tech equipment and busy researchers who glanced at him with mild curiosity. His eyes searched for anything out of place, any clue that might shed light on the situation. Near Anna's workstation, David noticed a small, secluded office that seemed unusually secure, with a keypad lock and heavy steel door. "Whose office is that?" he asked the security officer. "That's Dr. Lorton's, our head researcher. But he's been on sabbatical for a few weeks. No one's been in there since." David's pulse quickened. "Can we get inside?" The officer hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose I can show you, just to look." Inside, the office was immaculate, almost unused. But as David scanned the room, his gaze landed on a stack of financial statements on the desk. He flipped through them quickly, his eyes catching frequent payments to a cryptic account, one he recognized as connected to the underground networks Michael had mentioned. Before he could read further, the officer stepped forward. "We should leave now." Back outside, David's mind was ablaze with the implications of his findings. If Dr. Lorton was funding illegal activities, could Eric have been involved not just as a participant but as a victim? He called Detective Lane immediately, his voice urgent. "Detective, we need to talk about Dr. Lorton. There's something going on in the lab, something big." The detective's response was swift and serious. "I'm on my way." As David waited, he realized that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but the full picture was still horrifyingly unclear. Was Anna just a scapegoat, or was she more deeply involved than he feared? The answers seemed just within reach, yet obscured by layers of deception and danger. The lab was once again under scrutiny, this time with Detective Lane bringing a team of forensic experts. David waited in the lobby, his mind a tangled web of theories and fears. The entrance doors swooshed open, and Detective Lane approached, his face stern. "David, we need to talk." "We've made some discoveries," the detective began, leading him to a private room. "What is it? What did you find?" David asked, barely containing his anxiety. "In Dr. Lorton's office, hidden in a false bottom drawer, we found documents and communications that suggest he was leading a double life involving illegal drug trials. Eric Dalton was deeply involved, not just as a participant, but as an enforcer trying to keep things under wraps." David absorbed this, his thoughts racing. "And Anna? We're still putting the pieces together, but it looks like she might have been trying to expose them. We found encrypted files sent from her computer to an anonymous whistleblower site just days before the incident." Relief and fear warred within David. So she wasn't involved in his death. "It's complicated," Detective Lane said, sighing. "We think she confronted Eric about the illegal activities. Things escalated, and in a panic, she might have used substances from the lab to defend herself." David leaned back, the implications enormous. "Where does this leave her legally?" "It's not clear-cut. She acted in self-defense, but the manner of death complicates things. We're going to need her to tell us everything." At the station, David sat across from Anna, her face weary but relieved to see him. "David, I've been so scared," she started, her voice trembling. I know. The detective told me everything. You were trying to stop what was happening at the lab." Anna nodded. "Eric threatened me when he found out I was going to expose the trials. That night, he came to confront me. It all went wrong so fast." David reached for her hand. The truth will come out, Anna. We'll get through this. As they spoke, Detective Lane entered. Mrs. Thompson, we have enough to arrest Dr. Lorton and uncover the whole operation. But we need your full cooperation. Anna agreed without hesitation, her resolve clear. Anything to end this nightmare. Weeks passed, and the trial was a whirl of testimonies and revelations. The public was shocked by the depth of corruption and danger lurking within a respected research facility. Dr. Lorton and several accomplices were convicted on multiple charges. As for Anna, her actions were deemed justifiable self-defense given the circumstances, and with her crucial role in exposing the illegal trials, she was granted immunity from prosecution. On the day of her release, David was waiting outside, the sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Anna walked out, her freedom tangible in the brightness of her smile. "David, I can't believe it's over," she said, embracing him tightly. "I always knew you were innocent," David replied, holding her close. "Now, we can start over." Anna looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Let's leave everything behind us. A new beginning." As they walked away, a figure watched from a distance, his features obscured by the light. It was Michael, Anna's brother, who had played his own part in bringing the truth to light. Smiling slightly, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, content that justice had been served and his sister was safe at last. David and Anna moved forward, hand in hand, into a future that was uncertain but theirs to shape, away from the shadows of deception that had once threatened to engulf them. Their journey was not without scars, but it was together, and that made all the difference.